at all. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Ronald Williams. And Ellen, his assistant.
Aloha mai kako.
Aloha.
Ron Williams Jr. ko inoa piha. He kumu wau e ke hulului o Hawai'i nui a kea I loko ki UH Manoa. My name is Ron Williams Jr. I am a teacher at the Center for Hawaiian Studies, which is the Kamakaʻu Center for Hawaiian Studies at UH Manoa. We're now within a larger college. Years. I live in the archives. My friends call me an archive nerd. But for me, it's just an amazing place. It's a place full of voices. Yeah, voices come to you, stories come to you, and they talk to you, and they ask to be heard. And you're given the honor of being able to bring those voices and give them some kind of platform, whether it's writing about them or talking about them or so forth. And what I've found here in Hawaii is that these voices are numerous and they're loud. They've been speaking for almost 100 years. We just haven't been listening. And as I do more research and as I start to work on things like the overthrow and bayonet and the 19th century in Hawaii and so forth, I start to understand how loud and resounding they were. And that's important because what we were taught a mere 15 or 20 years ago was that Hawaiians were docile and they kind of just gave up and they didn't really fight against annexation and so forth. Dr. Noinoe Silva, one of my mentors, was the first one to kind of say, no, that's not true. I can show you the anti-annexation petitions and so forth. Those voices that are in the anti-annexation petitions spoke elsewhere also. They spoke in their churches, they spoke in their schools, they spoke on the streets and everywhere. And they resound with a uniform voice about love of nation and love of their elite. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Tonight we're going to talk about history and why we have such a, I have to be careful in a church, messed up history. And why, and how it's starting to change. I used to give this lecture 7 or 8 years ago and it was a little more depressing because it was just like, well, here it is. Now we're able to say things are changing. There are incredibly brilliant Native Hawaiian scholars coming out of UH and elsewhere that are starting to write and talk about their kupuna. There's things that we're being able to platform and people are hearing. So that ball is kind of turning now, and we're starting to see a change. But let's start by thinking about what we don't know and why we know what we do know. Okay? In school we call that historiography, the study of history. So let's look at that as an issue. And I want to, a little bit off, let me fix that. There we go. So let me ask you a question. You don't have to raise your hand, I don't want to embarrass anybody, but just think in your head. Without even a picture, do you know the name George Washington? Do you know the name Thomas Jefferson? Do you know the name Abraham Lincoln? Okay. Top left corner. How many of you can raise your hand maybe because it'll be interesting. On the top left corner, how many of you know the name John Henry Wise and know what he did? About 3 or 4. Next to him, Emma Navahi. You probably know. She's from here, right? Okay, more. In the middle there, William Punahou White. Okay, no one? Emma Nakuina Beckley. Ramon Hoy Makekau. Tumateo Ha'alilio. Frederick Beckley from Molokai. Reverend Hihio from Ka'anapali. And I don't have a picture for her, but Kalua Palawa Kamo. How many of you know Kalua Palawa Kamo? Yeah? My point is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we're in Ola'a tonight, right? Which is about 7,000 miles from Washington, D.C. Yet we all know those names, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln. And we don't know these folks who are from the islands and who were heroes to their nation and fought and gave their lives and their livelihoods for their land and their queen. That's history. That's how a history is covered over and elided and a new history is imprinted. I'm fine with the fact that folks know George Washington, but maybe after we know these folks, or maybe in addition to knowing these folks. This is the history of these people in this land. So let's talk about some of these folks tonight and talk about why we don't know them. Okay? So I talk about silenced voices. I'm always talking about the fact that the voices were silenced, that the Hawaiian language materials were silenced. There's probably no other main factor, no other major factor that's more important than language in our historiography. We've so normalized the use of English, and English being the language we all use, But in the 19th century, it wasn't. These people were talking and writing and passing notes and writing documents and doing all kinds of stuff, maka'olelo Hawaii, in their native language. Yeah? By the 1920s and 30s, the language was declining. By the 1970s and 80s, hardly any historians spoke Hawaiian. So when you had folks like Ralph Kuykendall and Gavin Dawes and write these general histories of Hawaii, they didn't access any of the Hawaiian language sources. They accessed only the English language sources. Now what does that mean? At the time of the overthrow in 1893, the Haole population in Hawaii was about 6% of the population. Okay? So think about the fact that 99% of your books about Hawaii were written from the voice of 6% of the population. Missionaries, missionary wives, ship captains, store traders, and so forth. Now I'm not saying they all lied, I'm just saying that's a small, tiny part of the population. The other 94% of people wrote and spoke and documented things in maka'olelo Hawaii. And we never accessed that stuff. So it's like we have a crime, a murder, and we have 10 witnesses, and we've gone up and asked one person what happened, and then we went away and wrote the report. Well, what about what they have to say? Yeah? If you're thinking about what happened in Hilo in 1870, you want to know what happened in Hilo in 1870, and you don't speak Hawaiian, what do? You go back to the newspapers of that time, the Pacific Commercial Advertiser and so forth, and you say, oh look, here's the history. But do you know what the Pacific Commercial Advertiser was? Yeah? Do you know what that voice is? Do you know who's saying that? What about what the 400 other people were saying in their newspapers? Maybe you'll get a different story, maybe you'll get a similar story, we don't know. But that's the problem with Hawaiian history today, is that we've written 99% of the history from that 6% of the population. I don't want to belabor the point, but I want to give you one more kind of analogy because it's a really, really important thing to understand. If you were going to write the history of America, and it was 1900, and you wanted to come out with this official history of America, and so you go and you hire the most famous historian in the world. This is an Italian guy who's an amazing academic historian. And he goes to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and he goes up to the front desk, and the lady tells him, we've got 5 billion documents here. And he doesn't speak English, he speaks Italian. He says, okay, well give me everything you've got written by Italians about America. And she goes back into those 5 billion documents into a corner and she finds these 500 documents and she brings them out and she gives them to him. And he sits down and he writes the history of America. And that becomes a book, that becomes a textbook, that becomes a movie, that becomes an after-school special, that becomes a TV show. And that becomes the history of America. That's what happened here in Hawaii. This tiny percentage of the population wrote a history of Hawaii that became the history of Hawaii. And the native voices were left behind. That's starting to change. So when I talk about what's missing, I'll give you some examples. Nuka Olelo Hawaii, Hawaiian language newspapers. We always focus on those, and it's great. But that's only a tiny slice of it. We have 125,000 pages of Hawaiian language newspaper digitized today. A lot of it has yet to be looked at. But we also have things like Leka Olelo Hawaii, Hawaiian language letters. People were writing letters back and forth. My dissertation comes out of a collection called the Judd Collection, mostly in the Bishop Museum. Albert Francis Judd was the Supreme Court Justice for the Kingdom of Hawaii. He was also the head of the churches. He was the head of the Ahuhui Wanalio o Hawaii. So all of the native pastors around the islands are writing to him about what's going on in the churches. But they're writing in the language they speak. They're writing in Hawaiian. That collection was closed by the Judd family until 2006 when it became open. So it's just come open since 2006. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters, Makolelo Hawaii, in that collection that people haven't read yet. That's information from the actual churches that's been left behind. Things like Kuka Kamilio Makolelo Hawaii, Mrs. Pakui's audio interviews. Mrs. Pakui went around the islands for 30 years and interviewed Kupuna Makolelo Hawaii in Hawaiian about their lives, their knowledge, about medicine, about places, about history. The museum today holds about 7,000 hours of interviews. They're digitized, and they're hardly ever accessed, especially by historians. When a historian, I won't mention any specific names, but when a historian, and it happens every 2 or 3 years, comes from New York or Boston and comes to Hawaii and says, wow, I find Hawaii interesting, and spends a summer here and writes a history of Hawaii, they're not accessing that stuff. And then Mele, Kanikau, lots and lots of different materials, Makolelo Hawaii. So let me give you an example from a couple of them. Newspapers. This is one I came across a few years ago. I was working on the Friends of Moku'ulo. I was working on some information for the death of Nahiena Ena and the funeral of Nahiena Ena and so forth. Okay, Kubu Hawaii, the Hawaiian language newspaper, has the funeral of Nahiena Ena, yeah? Wednesday, February 15th, 1837. Nakaho'oleva Ana. they have an actual image of her. This is from the newspaper. They have an image of the funeral procession. Yeah? Now these things are hugely important for historians and anthropologists. We can find out all about society by studying these things. And we look at her funeral order and we see that the funeral was headed by Kekahi Po'e Koa Mamua, Hawaiian warriors. Okay? Behind the Hawaiian warriors were Kahuna Lapa'au Mai, yeah? Medicinal priests, right? Behind the priests were missionaries. Okay? So Nahia Ana's funeral, arguably at that time the most important woman in the kingdom, the most sacred ali'i in the kingdom. She dies. Her funeral is led by Hawaiian warriors, Hawaiian priests, missionaries. Now, if you're a historian doing a story about Hawaii, or anybody doing a story about Hawaii, and you don't speak Hawaiian, you're not going to this paper. You're going to go to the English paper. At the same time, the Sandwich Island Gazette published about the princess's funeral. Sandwich Island Gazette. And they have, right there is her funeral. There it is. But theirs is led by missionaries. They have the funeral order led by missionaries. And that's very important, because people start to say, wow, as early as 1837, Christian missionaries had that much influence that they were leading the funeral of the most high ali'i in the kingdom. Wow, that's amazing. I'm going to write a paper about it. And they go on and writing about the order of the funeral and so forth from this source. Now, as a historian, I can't guarantee which source is true, but I start to contextualize them. I start to say who wrote what and why and so forth. And I find out that Kekumu, the Hawaiian-language paper, was edited by Reverend Reuben Tinker, who was the man who presided over her funeral. So I would tend to believe him, he was there. But the bottom line is we find two different stories based on whether we access the Hawaiian language materials or not. And it completely changes our history. Okay? So letters in Hawaiian. Dr. Noinoi Silva, as I mentioned, brought out the anti-annexation petitions. And we know about that fight. We know about the Royal Hawaiian Band resigning their positions rather than signing the Oath of Allegiance. Right? Those acts of resistance that empower people. Here's another one. This is a letter that I found from William Kealakai, who's a policeman in Honolulu, and he's writing to Sam Nolan, the Queen's sergeant, bodyguard, and he tells Nolan, tell the Queen that all 26 of us, Native Hawaiian policemen, are resigning from the force rather than serve the provisional government. That's a significant act of resistance. Those were significant jobs. Those were livelihoods. It wasn't like you quitting Walmart and going to work at Target. This was how you fed your family. Yeah? And this was a significant work of resistance. And it may seem kind of normal to us today. 10 years ago when I was teaching in Hawaiian studies, people were still saying Hawaiians didn't resist. So these types of things are very important, and they're out there. So, if we've left all that stuff behind, we haven't really listened to Hawaiian voice yet, what have we listened to? What is the history that we have? So I want to look at selected voice. What have we used? That's 6%. When I say 6%, what is that? Some of the main producers of historical material were things like the Pacific Commercial Advertiser, started in 1856 as the English language press, the foreign language press in Honolulu, still around today. Today it's called the Star Advertiser Bulletin something. William DeWitt Alexander was one of the main historians of that era, and also the Reverend Sereno Bishop. I'm going to talk about the Reverend Bishop later. He's one of my least favorite individuals. I try to be calm when I talk about him, and I call him the not-so-Reverend Sereno Bishop. But let's look at who these folks are, because something's written down, that's fine. Who wrote it and why? The Pacific Commercial Advertiser was started in 1856 and they said, during the annexation, they said at their masthead, we are an ardent advocate of annexation. Okay? Now that's okay. Everybody's allowed to their opinion, but when we're reading something from this source, we have to know where it's coming from. When you read a book today in Hawaiian history, from maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago, even today, and a new history book comes out, and you read that, oh, this is who Robert Wilcox was, or this is how the Queen acted, or so forth. And you look down at the source and it says, newspaper, January 15th, 1883, Pacific Commercial Advertiser. You go, okay, whatever. Now you know that paper was on one side of a battle going on, right? It was owned by William R. Castle, who was a member of the Committee of 13, an annexation commissioner to Washington, and who was appointed the president of the Board of Education. January 17th, 1893, the paper said, the foreign community is weary of Aboriginal dynasty. So they were straightforwardly out against the Queen. Which again, that's okay, but let's know that when we're reading sources from them. I reviewed a book, there's a book written about Robert Wilcox, about 15 years ago. And the book has about 900 sources. And so all the people that read it and academics that reviewed it said, oh my gosh, couldn't have been researched better. Well, like 95% of his sources come from the Pacific Commercial Advertiser. So yes, it could have been researched better. It could have been, you could have went through the Hawaiian language sources and seen what the other side said also. Okay? So that's the PCA. William DeWitt Alexander, as I mentioned, co-founder of the Hawaiian Historical Society, president of the Board of Education, president of Punahou School, and an annexation commissioner to Washington. He's one of the most prolific producers of historical material on Hawaii that gets picked up later and put into books and so forth. And he was an annexation commissioner to Washington. He said, the Kanakas are a dying race, steadily diminishing at the rate of 2% per annum. This is a pity, as they are an amiable and interesting race, and under enlightened control might do well. So he's our historian that's producing this material. So, let me move this. So, after the overthrow happens, many of you probably know the story. A small group of folks, overthrow the queen, and they admittedly have no intention of running the country. They plan on almost immediate annexation from the United States. They send a treaty off on the 19th to the United States, and they think it's going to be a done deal. But it's not. Yeah? The president removes the treaty from Congress, there's a pause, hey, well, hold on, let's see what's going on. So now they're kind of nervous, like, wait a minute, we've just committed treason, and overthrown a lawful government, so now we've got to make up a reason why. And so they have William DeWitt Alexander write a story about the overthrow. They call it the Revolution. And he's going to write a story about what happened to get out there very quick to the press and to the world. And he produces this. And an advertisement for it, this is an advertisement for the book in the Pacific Commercial Advertiser. And it says, the Hawaiian Revolution. And it says, it's accurate, impartial, and breezy. Now, as a historian, I have a problem with the fact that this accurate and impartial history is dedicated by special permission to the provisional government. Like, you can't be more straightforward than say, we're writing about this war and we're dedicating it to this one side. All of his sources come from the provisional government side. They're from Dole, they're from Thurston. He doesn't access any Hawaiians or royalists. Chapter 1 of his pamphlet says, the decadence of the Hawaiian monarchy. It is true that the germs of many of the evils of Kalakaua's reign may be traced to the reign of Kamehameha. He has, now I'm going to tell you the story of this in a second, but this pamphlet becomes a book, and in the book he has a section on infanticide. Dr. David Stannard has written about the myth of infanticide in Hawaii, but this is what he wrote in his pamphlet. Infanticide was fearfully prevalent, and there were few of the older women at the date of the abolition of idolatry who had not been guilty of it. It was the opinion of those best informed that 2/3 of all the children born in Hawaii were destroyed in infancy by their parents. They were generally buried alive, in many cases in the very houses they occupied by their unnatural parents. The principal reason given for it was laziness, unwilling to take the trouble of rearing children. So William DeWitt Alexander writes that 2/3 of the children born in Hawaii were killed by their parents because they were too lazy to raise them. And that becomes part of his narrative. Now, if it was just a pamphlet, that's awful enough, we just write it off. But it wasn't just a pamphlet. That pamphlet, as I mentioned, becomes a book. This is an actual copy. This is published in 1899 by order of the Board of Education, which William DeWitt Alexander is the president of. So he hires himself to write a history of Hawaii. This book that talks about that infanticide, that talks about the false history of the revolution, that talks about all of those things. This book, published by order of the Board of Education of the Hawaiian Islands, New York, it is very necessary to have a work of this kind in the hands of the higher classes of our schools. This becomes the school textbook for every school in Hawaii for 40 years. True story. 1899 to 1939. If you went to school in Hawaii, this was your school history textbook. It's been called a standard authority and school textbook for more than 40 years. 1899 to 1940. So when we think back and we think about how by the 1940s and 50s you could erase an incredible achievement of a nation of near perfect literacy, of having the first monarch that circumnavigated the globe, of having electricity before the White House at Iolani Palace, of having all these, of having an 1852 Constitution that gave universal suffrage to every race, 13 years before the end of the Civil War in America. When you think about this progressive modern nation, how that was all erased, you see things like this, and you see the fact that everyone for 40 years was taught this as history. And we know why we've heard that different story. By the 1940s and 50s, you start to think of Hawaiians as behind or slow or so forth. That's historiography. That's the creation of history. You get rid of the language so that folks can't access their stories, and you write these types of stories. That's changing history. So now let's move on to Reverend Sereno Bishop. He was the son of Artemis Bishop and Elizabeth Edwards, some of the third company of missionaries that came to Hawaii. He was the Lahaina Seamen's chaplain. He was the editor of The Friend. The Friend was the mission, a newspaper that came out once a month, or mission magazine or newspaper that came out once a month. He termed the Royalists my enemies. He was a member of the Hawaiian League, which was the secret group that pushed white rule in Hawaii in 1887. And he was a prolific writer on Hawaiian materials. This is a really important point. In my classes, I always tell my students, like, I don't pick out these folks and show you how awful they were just for you to get mad and hate them. I want you to understand that they're producing history that we're all still reading. Yeah? That's why it's important. You know, I could care, the guy's been dead 100 years, but his manao, his history is what we're still reading. That's why it's important to find out who they are. So the Reverend Sereno Edwards Bishop, he said, so when the Queen is elected in 1891, he writes about her in The Friend, in the magazine. He's the editor. He says, she enjoys in a high degree the affection of her Hawaiian subjects and their confidence in her attachment to their welfare. Her gentle and gracious demeanor, her good sense, and her fine culture have also commanded the high respect of the foreign community. Okay? He writes to an American magazine, and he says, she has a perfect use of English, a good literary, and especially sound musical culture. The Queen's manner is peculiarly winning, her bearing noble and becoming. The Queen gives evidence of having deeply at heart the moral welfare of her people. Okay? So he sees her that way. Now, a year and a half, 2 years later, his opinion of her, his writings about her change 180 degrees. Why do you think that might be? When she comes to power in 1891, she's basically a figurehead. She's under the bayonet constitution. The executive has to have everything they do pass through the cabinet. So she's really not a threat at all. She starts talking about a new constitution. The people start organizing for a new constitution. They start talking about bringing the power back to the executive. Now she's a threat to them. And so then he writes about her. He writes on January 14th, 1893, or January 13th, I'm sorry, which is 4 days before the overthrow. He's part of that group that's going to overthrow the Queen. And he writes to his friend, his businessman friend, Gorham Gilman in New York. And he says, we shall now be delivered from that incubus of the palace, poisonous to the natives and a perpetual threat and hindrance to white civilization. You know what an incubus is? And I'm trying to figure out here, incubus and succubus are demons that possess you sexually while you sleep. She would be a succubus, which I don't know if he's calling her manly or he just didn't know. But he's saying that about the Queen, that she's an evil spirit that possesses you sexually while you sleep. He writes, when the Queen goes to Washington and is fighting for the kingdom, he writes Gorham Gilman back and he says, my sister in New York sends me a story clipping of the most sickening laudation of Lil in her talk about Hawaiians. We should pause and talk about the fact that he knew very well that to Hawaiians it was very important that you pronounce her name. Yeah? Her Majesty Queen Liliuokalani. So he refers to her as Lil. Sickening laudation of Lil in her talk about Hawaiians. What Lil calls the downfall of her nation due to the missionaries is really a redeeming movement for them. They have been doing much better under the Republic, and now we are striving to lift them up into noble promotion to U.S. citizenship. But for the missionaries, Elle herself would have rotted away early as a common low creature. Yeah, that's pains, yeah? To think of him saying that about the Queen. But that's what he's writing about the Queen. Now, why he becomes important? I'm sure there were plenty of racists back then. Why he becomes important is because he becomes the main source of news coming out of Hawaii. The provisional government sets up a meeting between him and the head of the United Press. The United Press is still around today. The United Press and the AP and the Associated Press are the wire services that take stories and put them up on the wire. Newspapers can't have a correspondent in every city in the world. It's too expensive. So these people write stories, put them up on the wire, and then any newspaper can take it and put it in their paper. He was hired as the UP correspondent for Honolulu, for American papers. So all of the news, not all the news, but the vast majority of news coming out of Hawaii about the stuff that's going on is written by him. In a meeting set up by the Executive Council of the Provisional Government, he's hired as a UP correspondent 1894 to 1905. New York, Washington, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Concord, Charleston, lots of other cities around the United States published the stories that he wrote. And he wrote horrific stories about how Hawaiians weren't fit to rule, about how they didn't deserve to even be thought about, and so forth. He wrote columns like, "Annexation is the thing desired. The Republic has developed an ability to govern. Race supremacy. The character of the opposition. The future of Hawaii. Interesting gossip about King Kalakaua's widow." Now the thing that, but it gets worse. The thing that gets me is that, this is a reverend, is that he knew he shouldn't be writing these columns. There's 107 columns he wrote, and if you read them, it's really sickening. And he knew he shouldn't be writing them as a minister, so he wrote under a pseudonym. He chose a fake name. And so, in a series of over 100 columns, the Reverend Sereno Bishop updated an American audience to the affairs in Hawaii as the UP correspondent, Kamehameha. He used the name Kamehameha to write these columns. And it wasn't that he was trying to fool anybody. Kamehameha had been dead for a century. He was, in my opinion, he was using that name as a way to tell Hawaiians, I'll use the most sacred name you have to say that you're not fit to rule, that you're not fit to vote, and so forth. That's what the Reverend Sereno Bishop was doing. He wrote a column. So when we talk about America and Hawaii and so forth, we need to be careful not to generalize. I did an article a few years ago, an academic article about collegiate debates over annexation. It was fascinating. Harvard and Yale, Columbia, Georgetown, and the first college debate on the west coast of the United States was Stanford, which had just been founded, against the UC schools. And all these debates were about whether or not we should annex Hawaii. 1893, 1894. And in every case, the no side won. And some of it was racist. Some of it was they were saying, well, we don't want 100,000 brown people in our country. But some of it was also about justice. They argued, well, wait a minute, we're about of the people, by the people, and for the people. And both sides agree, if a vote was taken in Hawaii, it'd be overwhelmingly against. So how can we argue that we could take a country that doesn't want to be taken? And it was a good argument. So Sereno writes against that argument. And he writes a column called The Hawaiian Vote. And he says, this takes us back to the point first made, that the people of Hawaii, in quotes, must be a party to the contract for annexation. Here is the very question to be settled. Who are the real people of Hawaii? Are they the decadent and dwindling race of Aboriginal Hawaiians who still linger in the land, a feeble and inefficient people pushed aside from active life by the swarming Asiatics and the vigorous whites? Or are they not rather the fresh, active, brainy white race, who have by their skill and energy created the great wealth and thriving commerce of the islands, who own what they have thus created, and who are manifestly the heirs of the future of Hawaii, rather than the weak native race? Whites must govern. By reason of their superior capacity and force, the whites of Hawaii have become the real people of Hawaii. Signed, Kamehameha. Sereno Bishop is arguing that Hawaiians aren't even Hawaiian anymore. That if you want Hawaiians to vote for annexation, then us missionaries and ship captains and so forth will vote. But he's got to say something, because he doesn't, there's no argument against it. So that type of argument becomes very pervasive. Yes, America's about democracy. Yes, America's about justice, but these aren't really people. Yeah? And the only way you can say that is if you cover up that vast storehouse of achievement from the middle of the 19th century. He was also a bit of an egotist. He kept all of his columns in a binder, which I came across at the Hawaiian Mission Children's Museum. That's it there. So he has all his columns cut out and listed in there. And they're called Letters by Kamehameha. He comes out in the paper in 1902 and says, yes, I am Kamehameha Sereno Bishop. The thing that I found is, there's the Letters Kamehameha. But for me, as a historian and as somebody trying to look at this stuff dispassionately, the thing I found fascinating was that he knew that he had left behind his Christian ideals to follow these other ideals, these political ideals. And that's going to be a story I'm going to tell tomorrow morning if you get a chance to come tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to talk about the church's role in the overthrow and so forth, and what is the church? Because these folks being represented as the church, he writes a letter to Gorham Gilman in 1902, and he says, quote, the Kamehameha letters are probably something I'll pay for in the post-existence. This is a pastor who says that. So you can see how far that mission had come from bringing the word of God to the people to we've got to run the country at any cost, even if it means doing something I know I'm going to hell for. That's how far the mission had come. I don't tell you. So, I just finished an article that will be this year. It'll be in the 2015 Hawaiian Journal of History this year. And it's about that first territorial legislature. Because the story we had been told was, annexation, supposed annexation happens in 1898, end of story. You know, the whites took over. But what happens in that supposed annexation is that the oligarchy, that small group of white men that have been running Hawaii, now all of a sudden go, oh crud. I was good at that. I didn't cuss. Oh crud. We have democracy here now. And they're vastly outnumbered by Hawaiians. They're protected by the fact that 2/3 of the government is appointed. The judiciary is appointed, and the executive is appointed. The governor is appointed by the President of the United States, and so are the judges. But the legislature gets voted on. And so Sereno makes an argument that when they're drawing up the Organic Acts to create the territory, Sereno makes an argument. He says, it's too long to read the whole thing. America is entering upon a new experience in governing and educating undeveloped and weak races, lifting them up to higher things. It seems incredible that she should begin with an idiotic blunder of treating these feeble and childish souls as grown and strong men. So he's arguing about that Hawaiians shouldn't be able to vote. But nonetheless, in the Organic Acts, they do get the right to vote. And a little side note, just to know, the Organic Acts were created by a group of 5 men that were appointed to create the laws of the territory of Hawaii. The leader of those 5 men was a man named John Tyler Morgan, a U.S. Senator from Georgia. John Tyler Morgan was also 2nd Grand Master of the KKK. True story. In the official history of the KKK, written in an honorific way, he's listed as the 2nd Grand Dragon of the KKK. He was the man who was in charge of drawing up the laws for the territory of Hawaii. So race played a significant role in these events of this period. So the election happens, and sure enough, Hawaiians dominate that election. Good story. We have a victory finally, right? Robert Wilcox is elected as the U.S. representative, the first U.S. representative from Hawaii to the United States. The independent home rule party that Hawaiians had started, outside of the Democrat and the Republican Party, wins by a landslide. And so now we have Hawaiians, for once, for the first time in about 8 years, having some power in government, since the Queen has been deposed. And so what are those guys going to do? What's Governor Dole and Sereno Bishop and all those guys going to do? They've got to start talking bad about the legislature really quick, or else people will get the idea that Hawaiians know how to rule. So they do. The first day the legislature opens, they start saying awful things about the legislature. So back to my story about creating history. So what do you think Dawes and Kuykendall and Andrade and these folks that wrote histories of Hawaii in the 1950s and 60s and 70s and 80s, what do you think they wrote about the 1901 legislature? Every single book says it was the worst legislature that ever happened. That Hawaiians were incompetent, that they couldn't get anything done, and so forth. And it talks about them in a horrific way. All of that stuff comes directly from the English language materials. But if you go into the archives and you look at the actual bills that are passed, and you look at the thing that the senators are saying, Makalolava'i, you see an incredibly different story. This was the New Pepakuakua's opening show of the legislature. There were 2 cartoons published, one by the Hawaiian Gazette and one by the Pacific Commercial Advertiser, of this native-run legislature. And this blows me away, because I'm like, how do you have this on the street and nobody burns your store down? But this was the front page of the Hawaiian Gazette describing the native-run legislature in 1901. And it's literally monkeys in a jungle, with Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book underneath it. The poem about how they're gibbering and we can't understand what they're saying, and wag your tail, and so forth and so forth. That's the 1901 territorial legislature, according to the English language press. When the legislature closed on April 19th, 1901, the Pacific Commercial Advertiser printed this cartoon. The circus leaves town. The Hawaiian Simian Circus, and they're heading off to the woods. Now these men that were in that legislature were incredibly accomplished men. The men I talked about earlier, William Punahu White, Frederick Beckley, all of these folks were lawyers. They were incredible, they were former legislators, they were businessmen, incredibly brilliant men. They also produced work. They passed over 112 bills during that session, during that 60-day session, and all of them but 4 were vetoed by the governor. So of course nothing got done, but it wasn't because they weren't pushing bills. They passed a bill taking all the tax off of any implements used to grow taro. They passed a bill bringing Hawaiian language back into the schools. They passed a bill, this one I love, they passed a bill, the first county bill. In 1905, a county bill is passed that creates counties in Hawaii. But in 1901, they passed the bill first, and what it's going to do is decentralize power from the governor. Because those counties can elect their own mayors and so forth. So Dole doesn't like it, so he vetoes it. And it ends up not being passed. But another side note to that is they named the counties after the elite. They named Maui Lili'uokalani. And I have an article, I didn't put it in this PowerPoint, but I have a picture of the Maui News, and it says, the island of Maui has been changed to the name Lili'uokalani. They were a little bit early because the bill was vetoed, but it didn't happen. But they were doing these types of things. They were passing bills, they reinstigated Kalakaua's program of sending young Native Hawaiian students abroad to college. They did all these types of things that their constituents wanted them to do. And the governor vetoed them all, and then the white press said they didn't get anything done. They're incompetent. And then the independent home rule party falls apart in the next 5 or 6 years, and then we have this white hegemony that takes over in the 1910s and 20s. But that's history. That's using history. And as a historian today, you don't access the other side of the story unless you use those Hawaiian language sources. You get this. That's all you get. And you say, okay, there's history. If I'm running too long, wave, and I'll stop. So that's the 1910s. I was doing a project on John Henry Wise recently, and I went into the UH archives. John Henry Wise was the second Hawaiian language professor at UH Manoa. Beckley was the first, actually. And so I found the University of Hawaii yearbook from 1931. I said, oh wow, that's cool. 1931 UH yearbook. And it's split up like a history. It has different times, and the students' pictures are all within the times. And they have a part that covers the overthrow, and they call it transition, which is really nice. And they say in the UH Manoa yearbook, this period reveals the islands on the verge of dynamic changes. Queen Lili'uokalani was on the throne and had ruled despotically, bringing about changes without consulting the will of her people. Revolution soon followed, and her throne was seized from her. That's what every student at UH passed around to their friends to sign and took home and show their mom. And that's how normalized that narrative had become. That narrative of the queen being despotic, of Hawaiians not being fit to rule, all of these narratives have become normalized in the 1930s. So, let's talk a little bit of good news. Native Hawaiian Agency. There are thousands of these stories. I mean, I've pulled up a few. There's thousands of these stories out there. Examples of intelligent, brilliant, achieving Hawaiians that have done things. This is the Kawaiʻa Hut with Seminary for Girls. This is a story I love, because tomorrow morning we're going to talk quite a bit about the church. And this is within that, but I wanted to share it tonight also. So, the short version is in 1863, Boston pulls support back away from Hawaii for the missionaries and tells them, you're supposed to have a native-run church and you guys are still running the things. What's going on? You know, and basically they're supposed to shut down the mission and it's supposed to become a native-run church organization. The sons and grandsons of the mission don't like that idea. And they start to develop a new mission, as we saw Sereno carry out. Right? And the new mission is, we need to lead the country. We need to lead business, and so forth. And so, they run a lot of these different institutions, and there starts to be this fight developed between the congregations, and native congregations, and the 8 haole men who are running the churches in Honolulu, called the Hawaiian Board. One thing I want to point out too tonight, so I don't forget, is that that institution that we all call the Hawaiian Evangelical Association, and every archivist and every librarian except for Helen maybe, calls the Hawaiian Evangelical Association, isn't the Hawaiian Evangelical Association. Its constitution, written in 1853, calls it the Ahui Wanaleo o Hawaii. And it says our official language is Hawaiian. They were just producing English language reports to send back to Boston, so people could read them in Boston. But historians have taken those reports and written about this haole institution that was called the Hawaiian Evangelical Association. No, it was the Ahui Wanaleo o Hawaii. And if you read those reports, they're a lot different than the English language reports. Okay? So, I got sidetracked. So, in 1886, Kalakaua's 50th Jubilee, he's going to celebrate. There's people from around the islands are coming to Honolulu to celebrate the king's birthday. And people are ecstatic. All the schools are making special things. Schools are writing chants and so forth. The princess, Liliuokalani, personally goes to Hawai'i Seminary, where she's supporting several girls there. She goes there and invites them in person. She tells the girls, I want you to come to the Kalakaua Jubilee as my guests. And they're ecstatic. And they spend weeks making new dresses, they make new banners, they practice their oli for the king. The trustees of Hawai'i Seminary, there's another picture, were these three men. Albert Francis Judd, who's the head of the churches, the Reverend Charles Hyde, and the Reverend Sereno Bishop. Reverend Sereno Bishop and the trustees tell the girls they're not allowed to go. They say, go back. Reverend Sereno Bishop says, no woman should fall under that heathen's gaze. And no, you can't go to the palace, that place of debauchery and so forth. And so that story we've had of Christianity brainwashing Hawaiians and making them docile, and these are only young girls. So what do you think those 14, 15, 16-year-old Native Hawaiian girls did? They started a petition to oust those gentlemen as trustees of their organization. They passed it around town. They gained support throughout the next 3 weeks. On January 1st, 1887, all three of these men had to retire from the board of the Hawaiian. So the idea of this haole dominance of, by using religion and so forth is ridiculous. These young Native Hawaiian women had them all fired. Yeah? And why don't we know that story? Those are the stories that are out there. Kaumakapili Church. Kaumakapili Church had a issue as many of the other churches had. My dissertation focuses on Ka'aklesia o Waine'e, which is Waine'e Church in Lahaina. The church is founded by Keopuolani. That church was the center point for an explosion of resistance that happened within churches, where Native Hawaiian Christians said, we are both Christian and royalists. We are both Christian and Hawaiian. You can't make us be one or the other. And those churches had there were some pastors who listened to the administration and preached pro-annexation and preached against the Queen. And in every case, the congregations rose up and kicked them out of the pulpits. Vananalua in Hana, Waine'e in Lahaina, Kaumakapili, they said, which shows you it wasn't a brown-white issue. These are native pastors. But if you're going to preach against the Queen, you're not going to be our pastor. Yeah? And so they rose up, they kicked them out. At Kaumakapili, the pastor's name was Reverend Waiamau, and he was pushing pro-annexation rhetoric. And there was a lot of pilikia in the church. And so Reverend Hyde, the man I showed you earlier, who was kind of Ho'okano, he kind of thought, Hawaiians, they listen to me and they like me and so forth. And so he writes to Boston and he says, I'll take care of this problem. And so every Wednesday night, they had prayer meeting at Kaumakapili, where the pastor would choose a Bible verse and read it. And people in the crowd, Kupuna would stand up and say how it related to their lives, the certain Bible verse. And so Hyde says, I've got this taken care of, So he goes in the thing in the church and he writes, I was the only haole in the building. And he says, he reads, and I hope I can remember oh, here it is. I don't have to remember. 2 Corinthians 6:17. No laila ke I maila kahaku, e puka mai oko mai vaina mai oloko, ka'avale oko. In English, therefore saith the Lord, come out from among them and be ye separate. So separate yourself from evil. Yeah? Be separate from evil. And he writes, after I gave the verse, one after the other, Kupuna stood up and said, well, that's exactly why we're trying to get rid of you. And he was flabbergasted. He was attacked, But it's that idea of not being docile, not being brainwashed, not being dominated, but saying we know what we are, and we will continue to be that. William, getting close, finishing up. So William Punahou White is is a man that's dear to my heart. His full name is William Punahou Aveoveo Ulo Okalani White, and he's a voice that came to me about 15 years ago, and I've been working on him for 15 years. I've had the pleasure of meeting almost 70 of his descendants now that have come from California, that have come from Colorado and elsewhere. He was one of the most important, and I don't want to sidetrack anybody else's mana, but he was one of the most important Hawaiians of that period. He was Native Hawaiian. He was half haole, half Native Hawaiian. He was a senator from Lahaina. He was born in 1851. He was called Oily Bill because he had such a great speech. His voice flowed from him. And I've seen a little snippet. This is just one of those stories about what's the difference between Western history and Hawaiian history. A Western historian, a Western-trained historian would say, oh, he was a great speaker. Okay, so what school did he go to? You know, he went to this school, and this school, and this school, and this school. As a Hawaiian, if you want to know about this man, what do? You look at his genealogy, right? And you find out that the story doesn't start in 1851. His grandfather was Kaeakea, Kamehameha's main orator on Molokai. Yeah, one of Kamehameha's most favorite orators. You go, oh, that's where it comes from. So he becomes one of the great orators of the Senate. He works along with Joseph Navahi. The Queen credits him, Navahi, and Sam Nolan as being the main authors of her new constitution. On January 14th, 1893, when the Queen is planning on proclaiming the new constitution, she starts the day after she's prolonged the legislature. She comes over to the palace, she goes into the blue room, she sits with William Punohu White and Joseph Navahi, and she awards them the Knight's Order of Kalakaua, the highest award in the kingdom. And she calls them great patriots of the nation for their work. He worked in the legislature to draft to have a new constitution to replace Bayonet. He was one of the 6 men that was voted on to replace Joseph Navahi as head of Huiloha Aina. He writes the Queen a letter in 1894 telling her about an organization on Maui called the Citizens Reserve. And he sends the Queen their constitution. And it's a secret organization on Maui that has been set up because they don't know which way things are going to go. And they say, if revolution happens in Honolulu and our forces are taken over, all the leading Hawaiians in Maui will be rounded up and shot. And it's signed by these different men. And he sends that on to the Queen. So he's the Queen's eyes and ears in Lahaina. He leads the fight at Waine'e Church against the pastor. He's arrested on July 8th, 1893 and goes to jail. He spends his entire life doing these types of things. I searched for his grave for about 20 months, 30 months, and I couldn't find his grave. I found his wife. His wife is buried at Ka'ahumanu Cemetery, Queen Ka'ahumanu Cemetery in Oahu. I had the pleasure of meeting Kupuna I was doing a presentation downtown on Joseph Navahi, and I mentioned William White, and he's like, that's my great-grandfather. I'm like, oh my gosh. So we started talking, and I used to go up and meet him up at the Queen's Summer Palace. He used to live on the grounds of the Queen's Summer Palace. And I didn't want to be Ho'okana or Niele, so I just kind of would listen to him. And after a few weeks, he said, Ron, is there anything you want to know? What do you want to know? And I said, I've never found his grave. And he said, I'll take you there. The Kalahai. So his niece, he's about 83, and so his niece came to pick me up in the morning, and we got in the car, and we drove towards Bishop Museum, and we turned by McDonald's, and we started going up, and I'm like, I know this cemetery, that's Queen Ka'ahumanu Cemetery, but he's not there. I didn't say that, I'm just thinking that. And we got out of the car, and we walk up, and he brings me over, and he points to a big piece of ground next to his wife, next to Emma, and he's like, he's there. And I'm like, Uncle, he's there? And he's like, yeah, he's there. And at first, to be honest with you, I thought maybe Uncle just has a story that he heard or so forth. But I contacted the Queen Ka'ahumanu Society Cemetery, and they have the original map of that land, and he's buried there next to his wife in an unmarked grave. So, I might get emotional, but it's these, when you start to learn these people and what they've done and what they gave to their nation and what they meant, to think that today we have a George Washington High School and a Lincoln Memorial High School and a 40-foot bronze statue of President McKinley in front of our main high school, and he sits in an unmarked grave. Those are the types of things that history has done that we need to change. John Henry Wise. I told you I was going to finish, and I swear I'm getting really close. John Henry Wise. John Henry Wise is another favorite. Local boy, he's from Kohala. John Henry Wise was born in Kohala to Rebecca Nava'a and Julius A. Wise of Hamburg, Germany. Julius Wise was a German who had naturalized as a Hawaiian Kingdom citizen and sworn allegiance to the kingdom. That's his dad. He attended Ainakea Government School in Kohala. In 1886, he graduated from Hilo Boarding School under Reverend William B. Olison. Olison was running Hilo Boarding School. He got the job at KS to be the first principal at KS, and so he took all of his star students over to KS. And John Henry Wise was one of his star students. In 1887, chosen by Reverend Olison as his select scholar in a group that will comprise the inaugural class at Kamehameha School for Boys. So he goes into KS as the first class. This is the baseball team that he helped start. The first baseball team at KS, 1887. This is John Henry Wise here. They were called the Kamehameha Nine, and they were the champions of the baseball league. He was a great athlete. He was a carpenter. He was brilliant, really good at math. This is the larger story of his life will be part of tomorrow too. So if you're interested, come tomorrow. But I can tell you now that the church, so those mission fathers, the mission sons that were running the Hawaiian board were in deep trouble. The churches were rising up against them. They couldn't control the Hawaiians. And so they said, we have to have a Hawaiian that we can bring the Hawaiians back into the church. And they choose Wise. He's going to be the guy. He's had missionary training his whole life. He lived boarding school, KS, and so forth. Now they send him to Oberlin Theological Seminary in Ohio, known as the most fiery revivalist college in the country. Yeah, Oberlin Theological Seminary. So this 19-year-old boy gets on a steamship in Honolulu and travels to San Francisco, and then to a foreign nation, and then takes a train across the country to Oberlin. While he's at Oberlin, and this is a side story that's kind of interesting, while he's at Oberlin, he helped start the football team. Football was rising in American colleges. There were 7 deaths in college football that year because they didn't wear pads or helmets. They just lowered their heads and hit each other. And so he writes, there's about 40 letters that he wrote home from Oberlin to the mission. And in one of them he says, don't tell my mom I'm playing football. But this is John Henry Wise here. But the really, really frustrating and interesting part of the story is the fact that he was the first native Hawaiian to play college football in America. And today, the people in this room know that. I mean, why isn't he celebrated? He's not in the Polynesian Football Hall of Fame. Their first Hawaiian football guy in there is in the 1940s. I wrote an article about him in the Hawaiian Journal of History. If you're interested in the story, the Hawaiian Historical Society, you can contact them and you can purchase a journal from them about his story. It's a really good organization to support the Hawaiian Historical Society. But so he's the first native Hawaiian to play college football in America. And not only that, the first year he's there, they were kind of average. But the second year, they go undefeated. They outscore their opponents 267-30. They beat Ohio State twice, and they beat Michigan twice. They finished their season by beating Michigan at Ann Arbor. And I found columns in Berkeley newspapers about the great Oberlin football team led by that Hawaiian, John Henry Wise. They say he could carry 3 men on his back. He was a guard, but they had guards carry the ball. But anyway, so this kid from Kohala was famous across the United States for football in 1892, and we don't know who he is. But even more interesting, his football coach in 1892, the guy who turned that team around, was a football player at Pennsylvania who was going to become a lawyer and got struck by lightning. True story. So he couldn't become a lawyer, so he went home to his Ohio home, decided he was going to coach football, went to Oberlin, asked the trustees, they said, we can't pay you. He said, I don't care, I just love football. He turned the team around, was a great, great football mind. So John Henry Wise from Kohala, his football coach in 1892 was this gentleman, who's John Heisman. The Heisman Trophy, the best college football player in the country every year gets the trophy named after him. John Henry Wise played football for him. And people don't know that story. These are the histories we should be celebrating. These are the things we should be talking about in the schools. Why doesn't the UH football team honor John Henry Wise? Why doesn't every high school football team honor John Henry Wise? That's the picture. So I got this picture from Oberlin College archives, and after I had written a story about it also in the Hanaho magazine, the airline magazine for Hawaiian Airlines. And I got a call from Denver, Colorado, one of his great-granddaughters. She said, I have that original photograph. That's my great-granddad. She said, but I didn't know the story. I just had this picture of my great-granddad. So it's those types of things, those linkings of history from those archives. You know, and to be honest with you, people like me are just, we're just transporters of knowledge. You know, it's just a matter of platforming. It's those folks, it's their voices that call out and say that they want to be heard, and they connect to their families today. That's what makes it so incredible. This is John Henry Wise in Washington, D.C. John Henry Wise was also the author of the Hawaiian Homelands Bill. Prince Kuhio is the one who brought it to Washington, D.C. Here's Kuhio. Here's John Henry Wise. John Henry Wise wrote the local bill that became a local territorial bill that then was transformed into a national bill. And I'm gonna give my opinion here for a second, which I usually don't do. But a couple of authors recently, prominent authors, have kind of criticized Wise and Kuhio quite a bit for their work for what came out of the Homelands Bill. And yes, the Homelands Bill is incredibly problematic in many ways. The blood quantum, the fact that they had given up so much and so forth. But you have to take into consideration, they had absolutely no bargaining power. They had no vote in Congress. They were just asking permission for something. And if you actually go back and read John Henry Wise's letters that time period, he says he really thinks the Hawaiian race is dying out, period. There will be no more Hawaiians in 20 years, he says, unless we get them on the land. And so he was passionate about creating a program that would do at least that. That was his mana'o. So 100 years later, to go back and criticize what came out of that without knowing that context, I think is problematic. So, what I want to finish up by saying is just that these voices, John Henry Wise, William Punahou White, Ramon Hoi Makakau, all of these folks left a record for us. They wrote prolifically. They write in the newspapers and they say, "I'm writing this for the future generations." They left their history. They left their mana'o. They left these links to us. It's just for us to listen, and it's way past time with us.